That's a perfect place for us to start this session. You know, greed is not a good idea. Across the world, across 80 countries, this "we are the 99% movement," you know, what began as the Occupy Wall Street movement and has become Occupy the World movement, is something that may not be driven by any political thought, it may not have any solutions, but it is a frustration, a global frustration that we cannot underestimate and whose authenticity we cannot discard. Some years ago, in fact, this last decade, there's been a lot of euphoria about globalization, its possibilities. For the longest time, we've been told that if you let money do its work, then the benefits will trickle down, and that one should not interfere with markets. But clearly, that has not come to pass. It's not something that holds anymore. That is an argument that is discredited. What must take its place is something that I think thinkers across the world are grappling with, and it is something that is one of the most urgent questions of our time. To discuss that emergency room, we have Tom Friedman, who really needs no introduction to most people in the globe, because in many ways he's been the messiah of globalization. He's, of course, the author of many influential books, The World is Flat, Hot, Flat, and Crowded, and most recently, That Used to Be Us, which is about how and why America's gone wrong. Also with me is Pratap Bhanu Mehta, who's the director of the Center of Policy Research in Delhi, and absolutely one of my favorite commentators and thinkers in India. He too has been a believer in markets and in liberal capitalism, but recently he has been rethinking and repositioning his thoughts. So let me start with you, Tom. As I said, in many ways, you were, if not the messiah, certainly a believer in the excitements and potential of globalization. You believed that it would drop the verticals, you know, nation states would not be important, talented people could access each other, and the world would become flat. We find today's just become more spiky. I wanted to give you a statistic from the New York Times, which said that just 1% of America has more wealth than the 90% of America, and that the top 25 corporate heads earned more than their companies paid in taxes. You know, so what went wrong, Tom?
Well, first of all, simply in defense of my own arguments, I would have to really recast, you know, what you said if you actually read Lexis Neology and World is Flat. My argument all along was that states actually matter more and not less. There is a school that said the state was going to disappear with globalization. I was not in that school. I was never in that school. I was in the school that said this is about hardware and software. Hardware is the sort of overall macroeconomic platform you use, socialism, communism, free markets. Software is about the regulatory environment, the rule of law that goes with it. Everything I've ever written has been about how you have to get that in the right balance. And that's really what I believed then, what I believe now. And I think what happened basically in the last decade, I can only, let me speak about America, but I find what's going on in India and America such an interesting parallel, was that basically our financial system grew so large, partly because it was able to tap into massive pools of global savings from China and elsewhere that was looking for higher returns. And it morphed into something that the Indian economist Jagdish Bhagwati said that I really like. Markets are really designed, or were designed to do and promote and fund creative destruction, the creation of new companies replacing old companies. And what happened on Wall Street was that it really morphed into destructive creation. That basically the financial system, in pursuit of higher returns, went into the business of betting on whether Lindy's sold more cheesecake than strudel, in a sense. And the returns that were built up from that became so large that it eventually corrupted our political system. I've written this, so I'm not saying anything I haven't written already, that our Congress today has really become a forum for legalized bribery. The House Financial Services Committee, which oversees Wall Street, has 61 members. Now, we only have 435 members of Congress. How did they all how did 61 gravitate? I think at one point there were 70 or more. And that was because it became a way to raise donations from Wall Street. So it got out of balance. We're now going to get it into balance. That's what markets do. They overshoot, you come back, you see, and I think we have to get it into balance in a way that preserves the best and cushions the worst. Again, I'm called the messiah of globalization. All I was writing about it. I was excited about its potential. I was also the first person to write about the backlash of globalization. I've always been keenly aware it has its upsides and its downsides. You have to cushion the worst, and you have to try to nurture the best. That's what government is there for. But I promise you, I didn't do this, okay? It was technologies that came together. I wrote about it. I found it fascinating. There's things that excited me about it, things that frightened me about it. But I find that it's very interesting on the subject of globalization. If you say anything positive about it, you're suddenly the messiah. If you say anything negative about it, we should just get rid of it, you're a realist. So there's a certain kind of cockamamie, side of this discussion that I think we should get it into balance.
Tom, if one had really believed that you created this mess, then we wouldn't be inviting you into the emergency room. But you're still the doctor that we're asking for the diagnosis.
I appreciate that.
Pratap, I was just reading that there are two very interesting theories that have come up about this new phenomenon, There is what Paul Gilding has called, and Tom has written about that, the great disruption. People who believe that this is not just a passing phase, it's not the pendulum of the markets, but it is really a rupture in the world as we have known it, that it is ecologically and economically unsustainable to go with the kind of profit-based capitalism that has been the norm, And then there is another theory, which is of the big shift by John Hagel, which, again, Tom's written about, which says that this is a new phase, and that if you get more innovative and more talented, basically the loss of jobs is because of bad attitude, and people need to pull their socks up and gear themselves for a braver new world, Which do you think, Pratap, is the correct theory, or do you have a third theory about it?
I think one of the great lessons of this crisis is that we should be very careful about theories. I think this is the first crisis that was actually caused by intellectual complicity, not just crony capitalism. And if one were to characterize what that intellectual complicity was, it was basically to take a model and convert it into an invariant law. The first thing about a model is it's true only under certain conditions. You have to be intellectually, from a policy perspective, very sensitive to how those conditions are changing. And I think the beauty of Keynesianism, in a sense, is not the stuff about monetary expansion. It's Keynes always said the ceteris paribus clause is the most important part of a model. So I think the question we need to think through is not the model, the theory is what are the conditions we are confronting now, and how might those conditions change, and what will be appropriate to those conditions. So in that context, just two or three things. One, I think we have to be careful about characterizing what the it is here. As we know, markets have also come in very different varieties. They've been regulated differently. Even in the United States, 15, 20 years ago, intellectual property rights had a different structure. Financial markets had a different structure. So there have been different kinds of, at least modes of regulation of market. And I don't think there's any reason to suppose that in a sense this will require giving up markets. What it will require is, of course, a radical rethinking of some of the current organizational forms. It's not clear, for example, that markets are going to deliver the kind of or profit motives are going to deliver the kind of technological innovation we need for, let's say, things like climate change. It's not clear, for example, that the intellectual property rights revolution has always promoted innovation in fields like pharma. It has in some places, not in others. So there will be a rethink about those organizational forms. The second, I think, element, which I think is the real heart of the matter, is capitalism and democracy go together only up to the point that there is some story you tell about how that capitalist structure is in some senses fair or getting fairer. And there have been three essential elements to that fairness, which is I think what we need to focus on. First is the issue of inequality. I mean, I think the conventional wisdom that it's not inequality per se, it's inequality of particular kinds, inequality that is deemed inherently unfair, gone through illicit means that's objectionable. The second was that the creative destruction is genuinely innovative in the kinds of products it emerges. And the third and the most important, which I think Tom hinted at, is a liberal society is premised upon what Michael Walzer once called the art of separation. The social contract as you can make money, but you cannot have that distort other aspects of human existence and processes. I think the real crisis in this occasion was that not only did money corrupt politics, which is the obvious case to focus on, but its penetration into intellectual life. I mean, think of, in a sense, the interesting complicity between the economics profession and Wall Street, the penetration into media, and all these things we actually knew how to protect from this kind of penetration. In fact, the entire, I think sort of slightly left of center liberalism in the US, Europe, India, was precisely about creating these barriers. And I think the focus will have to reshift back to that market, but market in its place.
Tom, you mentioned about the regulatory frameworks, and that really for globalization to have been a positive and have yielded all the potency that it had, that there should have been great regulation, you know, and good frameworks. Pratap has brought up a very interesting dilemma, you know, which is that actually corruption occurs where the synapse between money and government happens, you know. And he's argued in his columns that it's a real dilemma because if you leave markets unregulated, it has its own corruptions. If government tries to regulate it, that's where influence begins to work, you know. So how does, when we're rethinking this new framework, how are we going to get around this?
Well, I think, you know, again, I can only speak from an American point of view, but to me there are several really basic reforms that I think we've learned that we need. If a bank is too big to fail, it's too big, okay? Because if it's too big to fail, you have moral hazard built into the institution. And I think one of the things we've learned here is that we have banks that are way too big to fail, and therefore they have to be broken up. That's been Paul Volcker's argument. I think the second big change that, again, came out of this crisis is transparency. That we had a global derivatives market that was basically completely opaque. So no one could see that one insurance company, AIG, had built up trillions of dollars of basically a risk that was vulnerable to any shift in the market and could, again, destabilize the whole system. So what I actually wrote about back in my first book on globalization, Lexis Neolatry, which was really reacting to a different crisis. Remember, the Mexican peso collapse, the Russia collapse, and something we had in America called long-term capital management. That was the progenitor of all this. This was a hedge fund that basically had built up so much debt by borrowing a little from each bank, but each bank didn't know what it had, what the other banks had done, that it built up a huge risk, you know, profile. And so to me, what you learn from this is that you have to control leverage. Leverage is basically what creates, takes something from a tactical situation to a nuclear situation, melt down the whole system. And the other is transparency. Now, why was there no transparency in the derivatives market? Because it created arbitrage opportunities for the bankers who dealt there. And so these are the two things that I think I would like to see the biggest changes. What is so distressing to me, and this is what I've been writing about, is that the financial industry in America, which has amassed so much capital between 1990 and 2010, I wrote about this the other week, the financial services industry paid in donations, political donations, $2.3 billion to the Republican and Democratic parties, which was more than the transportation industry, the energy industry, the healthcare industry, and the defense industry combined. That's how big this got. And what is distressing now, it's still so big that we had this Dodd-Frank legislation. We can't get it through. And they have not stepped back and said, wait a minute, we just dodged the biggest bullet in our lives, okay? they are fighting this tooth and nail. And I think that's one of the things that actually produced Occupy Wall Street. It was like, what is it you don't get? You almost blew up the world, and now you're fighting tooth and nail against these reforms. I think that's the real sense of anger out there at this industry.
Pratap, before I come back to you, Tom, there's just one other question, because you've talked about big, you know. Yeah. In many ways, that's been an American sort of anthem, you know, large, free. Yeah. And you've also written recently that America's finding it difficult to swim in a world that has a Made in America tag, you know. And yet you said that although India and China are doing well, that it's not really lessons from India and China that you need, but to go back to the history of America. Yes. So can you talk us through a little bit about this idea of American exceptionalism? Yeah. You know, what are these qualities that you have faith in?
Yeah. So, you know, our new book, which I wrote with a friend of mine, Michael Mandelbaum, from Johns Hopkins, is called That Used to Be Us. And people ask, the first question always is does it have a happy ending? And we tell them it does. We just don't know whether it's fiction or nonfiction. That's what we're wrestling with. So, but the reason this book has a forward-looking theme but a backward-looking title, That Used to Be Us, is because what we argue is that America basically had a formula for success, that we got to where we got as a country because we actually had a formula that goes back to our founding fathers, to Hamilton and to Lincoln. And it's built on 5 principles, and maybe these apply also to India. One was educate your people up to and beyond whatever the level of technology is so they can get the most out of it, whether it was the cotton gin or the supercomputer. So first we had universal primary education, then universal secondary education for the Industrial Revolution, and then post-secondary education, which we haven't made universal, and I think that's something we have to talk about. Second was have the world's best infrastructure, roads, airports, telecom, to enhance and enable commerce. Third was have the world's most open immigration policy to attract the most dynamic and energetic immigrants where they would go to Silicon Valley and other places and start 30% of the new companies every year. Fourth was have the best rules to incentivize risk-taking and prevent recklessness. And the last was have the most government-funded research to push out the boundaries of science and technology so innovators and entrepreneurs could pluck them off and start new industries. That was actually our 5-part formula for success. Now, what we argue in the book is basically we made 2 of the most fundamental errors a country can make at the end of the Cold War. The first was we misread our environment, which is the most dangerous thing a species can do. We thought the end of the Cold War was a victory. And in many ways, of course, it was. And it was a great victory for freedom and for unleashing free people. But it also was, in a wonderful sense, it unleashed 2 billion people just like us, able to compete, connect, and collaborate. And just when we actually needed to be lacing up our shoes, we put our feet up. Then we compounded it in the second decade of the first decade of the 21st century after 9/11 by spending a whole decade, tragically, maybe necessarily, who knows, historians will decide, chasing the losers from globalization, called Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, rather than the winners, called India, China, Brazil, and the others. So we really dug ourselves into a deep hole. Now, so then if you look at those 5 parts of that formula for success, you know, what do you see today? Education. Well, we've really fallen down the global, you know, in our biggest cities, we have 50% dropout rates, okay, from high school. If you don't have a high school degree in today's economy, there's no longer anything down there for you. You know, the biggest company in Baltimore, Maryland 50 years ago was Bethlehem Steel. You could get a job at Bethlehem Steel 50 years ago, drop out of high school, join the union, get a good job, be able to buy a house, get a mortgage, 2 kids and a dog, and retire, and lead your whole life with a high school or less than high school degree. Today, the biggest employer in Baltimore is Johns Hopkins University Medical Center. They don't let you cut the grass at Johns Hopkins without a BA, okay? So, so first, we've fallen down on education. Second, we've fallen down on infrastructure. And those of you, you know, we have a huge infrastructure deficit. I just flew from Hong Kong to Los Angeles Airport, LAX, a couple of weeks ago. You fly from Hong Kong to LAX, it's like flying from the Jetsons to the Flintstones today. I mean, you know, you can really see the stark difference. Third, on immigration, I mean, I'd love all of you to come to America, okay? Unfortunately, if you've been watching our Republican debates, It's basically a debate over who can build more electric fences to keep Mexicans out. You know, so the whole sign we're putting up on the country is, go away. Please come here, get a degree, excel in our schools, and then get the hell out of here. You know what I mean? That's basically what we're telling the world. Fourth, the rules for capital formation. Well, how did you like that subprime crisis? And lastly, government-funded research. If you've seen that chart in America, the graph looks like an EKG heading for a heart attack. So we're off our game. We're off all 5 principles.
Pratap, you know, Tom's been talking about America, but in India, we are all feeling the same rumbles. You know, could you run us through a similar diagnosis of what's wrong with India?
I need more characters than Tom. Well, I mean, I think 2 things very quickly, and then I'll just run through a couple of points. One, I think we do have to acknowledge that different countries and citizens within countries are positioned differently in relation to what's going on. And I think in India you have both processes simultaneously, which are there are millions who are clamoring to join capitalism, as there are millions who are actually disenchanted with it because at least they see the destructive aspect it's taken. Now, at one level, I think the story you would tell about India would be actually similar to Tom's. I think infrastructure, no-brainer. Education, no-brainer. Government funding of science and technology innovation, no-brainer. I mean, I think what's interesting is how industrial policy, in a loose sense, is back in all countries.
No, it's not happening. Government funding of science is often...
It's sloppy, or at least the way it's structured. Immigration, and you know, maybe if you want to generate some contention, I think the real question is whether there can be labor mobility for the poor. The real question is not whether there can be labor mobility for the skilled. In fact, one of the critiques of this form of globalization is precisely that. And that even if you have labor mobility for the skilled, its effects on reducing global inequality are much less than labor mobility for, let's say, poorer or lower, lower middle class. So we stand differently on the immigration story. I think for us, to be honest, I think the critical question is the following, which is, I think 20 years ago we created, or at least there was an implicit assumption that there will be a new social contract, and the new social contract will be the following. The fundamentals of India's position in the global economy at the moment give it certain advantages. It is true that demography does add 2 or 3% to your growth rates. I mean, there's a new paper out by Ashok Modi which demonstrates that even for UP and Bihar, right? So demography gives us an advantage. Labor costs gives us an advantage. The flat world that Tom Friedman talked about actually does give us an advantage. In fact, I think that is a big structural challenge for the US, which is even if they innovate, the whole manufacturing process and the catch-up ability of countries like China and India is much greater than it was 15, 20 years ago. So at one level, this is our game to lose, right? But the contract was the following, which is you let private capital, appropriately regulated, free to produce high growth. That high growth will translate into high government revenues, even without raising taxes. As we did see for a 10-year period, 20, 30, 35% annual rates in increasing government revenue. That government revenue needs to be deployed for all these things that we are talking about. Education, health principally, it's the one thing I'm actually most worried about India, where almost, in education at one level, I think we understand the dynamics. I think the demand side equation on education has changed. And there's a real push from the bottom, which will transform our education system. It will not happen because of government, it's happening despite of government, but it is happening. I think health, if you look at morbidity figures, malnutrition figures, I think that is I think the one issue, public health, which we really, really are lagging behind. And that's actually fixable, it doesn't take that much.
Pratap, but listening to both of you, I think both of you are talking about changing structures, rethinking some of it. To me, the elephant in the room is ethics, everything, even the new social contract. You were talking about theory, that we shouldn't get into theories, but unless we inject ethics into this, whatever we construct is going to fall flat again, So how does one create ethics, a dharma of capitalism?
I mean, so if one puts on a historical hat, I think the dharma of capitalism is a much more complicated question, because the brutal truth is that dharma arises not out of good moral intentions, but it arises out of a competition of interests. One of the reasons liberal societies have to insist that there not be concentrations of power is because different different sections of society can hold other sections of society accountable. So in that sense, I think institutional morality, which decenters power, is a central element of the second aspect of ethics, which let me throw out something kind of more mischievous, and I think it's related to the financial crisis. So the thought I want to put forward with you is the following, which is one of the reasons. So we often say money has become much more important, which has led to a culture of greed, which has then led to all these other things that we don't like. But there's an interesting compulsion about money in modern societies that almost all theorists of modernity talked about, which is traditional hierarchies have broken down, right? How is it that people can objectively affirm their own sense of self-worth and achievement? What is a measure of that? Now it turns out the attraction of money in part is that it is objective, unambiguous, not dependent on small closed hierarchies of judgment, right? And I think a deep challenge democratic societies have to face is that we can talk about the culture of money a lot, but I think it has deep roots in the very things that make modern societies democratic and egalitarian. I mean, one of the interesting sidelights of the financial crisis is that at one level the professions, if you look at management consultancy, American universities, they are far more meritocratic places than they were 25, 30 years ago. I mean, they're genuinely open, right? Barriers of race have fallen and so forth. But one of the paradoxes of that is that they also went from being guilds, professional guilds which were governed by norms, judged by communities of peers, to organizations where you actually are looking for objective, unambiguous measures of performance. Turns out the only viable candidate for that was money, right? What else? Anything else would depend on either a closed community of judgment or a hierarchy, right? So I think democratic societies, we have to think harder about the very things that make democracy and equality exciting actually produce these pathologies. I think the greed part of the story is the easy part of the story, right? I mean, I remember asking once one top sort of lawyer in Delhi, or it's part of a research into the legal profession, about sort of lawyers' fees and how much they earned and so forth. And he turned to me and said, look, for him, his fees was the only true measure of how well he had done, not for the money, but it was the only objective measure of how society valued him. And that, I think, is the problem we need to focus on. How do we come up with other measures that honor the egalitarian and open spirit of liberal democracies, right? And yet don't degenerate into a single point agenda.
One is if you want to tackle that philosophical question that Pratap just put out, that how do you do this? And a second question, Tom, is that what we are not discussing is that money as we know it today, corporations, the capital project, has built itself on the backs of the poor. There is a resource capture, a reliance on very poor labor markets. China, India, they're doing well. You can't compete with, America is facing a disadvantage because there are poorer and poorer people willing to do it cheaper and cheaper, So there is an intrinsic inequality in the way capitalism accumulates wealth, you know. And to me, I feel this is a challenge now to rethink. We've been told that industry is the only answer, urbanization is the only answer. You've spoken about the fact that reliance on toxic oil, you know, the climate change debate, all of that are really things which are also factors in why capitalism is in a crisis, you know. So is it, I mean, in India, for instance, can we really generate, Pawan Sukhdev is coming tomorrow, and he said something that really stuck in my mind. He said, can we really generate jobs, 350 million people making Jaguar cars, you know? Is that the way that we're going to go? I think the emphasis has to be on agriculture, on preserving nature, you know, in green technologies. We're not discussing that, so could you address that?
Let me try to talk about both the values point to pick up and then on your question. So 1999, I wrote Lexus and the Olive Tree, and one day I was home and someone had sent me a bunch of books to sign, and a delivery man came and he put them on the kitchen table, probably 100, and I said, why don't you just wait here, you know, while we're doing it. So he picked up the book. It's called Lexus and the Olive Tree, and he was African American. He said, so the Lexus, that's like technology, right? And he said, the olive tree, that's like a values, right? I said, yeah, you got it. He said, where does God fit in? He said, he was very religious. He said, I've been in the presence of our Lord Jesus Christ. Where does he fit in? And I will tell you, over the years, I've been struck at how many people have asked me, is God in cyberspace? And it's a sort of an interesting question. And I think that, you know, in the Jewish tradition, which I come out of, you know, there's sort of two views of God. One is that he's this very active agent, sort of biblical view. He smites evil and he rewards good. He intervenes in the world. And then there's a post-biblical view of God, which says basically God is only present by what you do. So if you want God to be in cyberspace, you have to bring him there by how you behave there. Because cyberspace is this really open system. So I will confess something to you. You know, I talk the talk of globalization, but I actually don't walk the walk, okay? I'm a late adopter of everything, okay? From cell phones to Twitter to Facebook to all those things. And the reason is because I've always felt this globalization system, the internet, cyberspace, these are systems that allow us to interact totally nakedly. There are no filters. There's no editor, no libel lawyer, no parents. And therefore, it actually demands much more of the old-fashioned stuff. You can't be there when your kids are on the net. You can't be there when your citizens are on the net. So all that will protect you is what you build into your citizens, values, in order to interact nakedly in the world. So it's actually that old-fashioned stuff that you get from church, temple, synagogue, mosque, parents, good teachers, role models. Actually, all that old-fashioned stuff matters so much more in this world. And it's all the stuff you cannot download. You have to upload it the old-fashioned way, okay, with teachers and parents and whatnot. So that's what we've gotten away from. Now, on your second question, let me try to rephrase it a little bit, because to me the argument here is we have to be really careful that we don't take this to another extreme, okay? This is all terrible, it's all bad, let's just junk the system. I wrote a column a couple of weeks ago in which I pointed out there are actually two revolutions going on in America right now, and they're related. One is on Wall Street, really important, people expressing a sense of sort of just core injustice with what's going on there. But there's actually another revolution that's been going on in Silicon Valley. And these two are related, basically. That what happened over the last 3 years, if we in America hadn't had the subprime crisis and 9/11, this is all we'd be talking about. We'd be talking about the new IT revolution. So we went first from the mainframe to the desktop and the web. We've just gone from desktop and web to a whole new revolution of social media, Facebook, the Twitters, mobile, wireless connected smart devices, social, mobile, and cloud. Now there's this cloud up there that suddenly allows you and me, any individual, to access the same tools on an hourly basis of Google. Now you put social, mobile, and cloud together, you actually have a hugely transformative revolution going on. So I just came from New Delhi. I spent my time in the garages of South Delhi talking to Indian innovators who are starting companies overnight to solve Indian problems. I wrote about one that's invented a machine to cure to test for blindness. Another that's got a system for how to connect with farmers on exactly where to plant, when to plant, what weather conditions, etc. Do not lose sight of these. These are hugely empowering tools for the very people you're talking about. And I think there's a real danger that we lose sight of that. Now, so what do I think is going on just really quickly is that what this new revolution is doing is taking the world from connected to hyper-connected. And that accounts for, in a way, so many things that are going on. On the one hand, it creates more stress for the average worker. I tell my girls, I got to find a job when I graduated from college. You're going to have to invent a job. Okay, that's really, it's creating a whole new level of stress for workers. At the same time, through Twitter and Facebook, it's giving them whole new ways to express that stress and to organize about it. At the same time, this system creates huge income gaps, because if you have the skills now to reach a global market, the returns are fantastic. And at the same time, it's creating the opportunity for new people to start companies overnight. What's happened, I think, is that this revolution has gone so much faster than the ability of education and government to keep up with it. So it's leapt ahead, and we're now wrestling with that transition.
This is sheer serendipity, Tom, because I have a pretty embarrassing admission to make myself, which is that this morning, strangely, it's exactly the same thought that came into my mind. I was just thinking about the morning session with Hari and Shashi, and I was thinking that this social media and the internet and this entire technological connectivity is almost a kind of divine force. It's like the planet forcing change, transparency. It's just changing the structures of the world, and it's almost, like you said, God in cyberspace, So it's strange that one's thought should collide like that. Pratap, we are running out of time, so I'm going to leave the last word with you. I wanted you to leave the audience with a thought. And if you have time in 1 minute to answer this, that I met the president of the industrial board in a meeting, in a conference somewhere. And although he'd been part of the industrial board, I'm sorry if I was sounding like I was setting up oppositions between industry and, the green world. But he was saying that the idea is about doing different things in different places. Rather than bringing industry to high green agricultural areas, take industry to places that need industry, and then build up agro industries or agro-based things where there is a lot of greenery and fertility, So can you just talk about that and leave us with the last thought?
No, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, which is to say that I think you need a framework which has the flexibility, nimbleness to respond to the kinds of challenges we are actually going to face. I think Tom is absolutely right, which is I think you have government structures, education systems, thinking about alternative imaginaries that are actually very rigid and static, and not being able to grasp, I think, the complexity of our social systems. And one way of rephrasing what you're saying is that, in a sense, we are in now such a different and complex social system that these models, I mean, just to mention a travesty, for 10 years we wait for the national manufacturing policy, and what does the government come up with 2 days ago? Another policy on huge industrial enclaves. This is the kind of rigidity we actually need to get over.
Thank you so much for listening in. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Pratap.